From eye drops to poisonous mushrooms, some killers have resorted to unconventional and bizarre methods to commit murder. In this collection of true crime stories, we explore 4 chilling cases that defy logic and showcase the depths of human depravity. In a case that shocked Waukesha County, Wisconsin, a woman's betrayal of her closest friend knew no bounds, as she used a seemingly harmless household product to commit a heinous act. When police responded to a call in Pewaukee in October 2018, they encountered a scene that initially seemed to be a tragic but unremarkable suicide. 61-year-old Lynn Hernan was found unresponsive, surrounded by crushed pills and medication bottles. All signs pointed to Hernan intentionally ending her own life by overdosing on drugs. However, as the investigation pressed on, a far more disturbing reality came into focus. One of deliberate homicide by an unlikely weapon and perpetrator. Hernan had spent most of her working years as a hairdresser in Wisconsin. Never married and without children, she lived alone as her health drastically declined in her later years. Hernan suffered from lung disease, high blood pressure, and severe gastrointestinal issues that frequently landed her in the hospital. The mounting medical issues took a mental toll, and Hernan became depressed, withdrawing from friends and visitors. It was against this backdrop of Hernan's loneliness and fading independence that her close friend's daughter, Jessy Kurczewski, entered the picture and stepped up as Hernan's full-time carer. But Kurczewski was far from a saint. She had just recently been released from prison after serving an 8-year sentence for identity fraud and forgery. She started assisting Hernan with daily tasks and soon had power of attorney to pay her bills, a trusted friend during a vulnerable time. However, unbeknownst to Hernan, her caregiver had far darker intentions brewing. Over a 2-year period, the caregiver had systematically siphoned nearly $300,000 from Hernan's accounts. This large-scale theft set the stage for an even more sinister plot. Kurczewski's decision that a longtime friend was worth more dead than alive. On October 3rd, 2018, the caregiver called the police saying she found Hernan dead in her recliner. Initial suspicion fell on the myriad medications Hernan took, and her death was initially ruled an accidental overdose. 5 months after the crime, Kurczewski approached police to get finality on the case of Hernan's death, painting herself as a concerned caregiver.
I just want to know, because they kind of weren't sure. We didn't know if it was a suicide or if it was something medical. She was in the hospital shortly before. She'd been sick for years. We really weren't sure, if this is something, because the doctors could never figure out what was going on. Mm-hmm. So it was frustrating, and she had literally probably 10 boxes of medical documents. Okay. And, we just didn't know. And, I know what state she was in and where she was at, but I didn't. It's kind of frustrating because I was there all the time taking care of her. I'm the one who took her to the doctor. I'm the one who did everything. So the not knowing, and I wasn't there with her. So it bothers me because I go, could I have been there? Could I have helped? Could I have done something? That's my hardest part. Mm-hmm.
But toxicology results would later raise new questions when it revealed a lethal level of tetrahydrozoline in Hernan's system, the active ingredient in over-the-counter eye drops like Vicine. This revelation transformed an apparent suicide into a homicide case. Investigators soon uncovered evidence that Kurczewski had been secretly poisoning Hernan by spiking her water and drinks with eye drops over an extended period. What was initially dismissed as a tragic accidental death was now a calculated, premeditated homicide. In June 2021, nearly 3 years after Hernan's death, Kurczewski was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of felony theft from her victim. As the case made its way to trial in the fall of 2023 in Waukesha County, conflicting stories played out in the prosecution and defense arguments. At first, she denied any role in the death.
You're going to see almost 2 timelines. As I prepared for this, I kept seeing almost 2 timelines emerging. There's certainly a factual, bare-bones timeline of theft, murder, and more theft. But there's this almost overlaid timeline of all of the defendant's lies and deceit on top of that bare-bones timeline. That's a little bit tricky to go through and process, but let's start it.
Hernan a water bottle containing 6 bottles of Vicine eye drops to help her commit suicide. The defense argued that Kurczewski would have disposed of the water bottle if she really intended to kill Hernan. They also stated that Hernan regularly drank vodka mixed with eye drops and had 25 to 30 prescription pills in her system when she died. According to the complaint, crushed medication was found near Hernan's body, but no eye drop bottles were present at the scene. Prosecutors argued that PDF documents found on the defendant's phone related to different types of poisonings, like household poisonings and cyanide poisonings. When detectives asked if she knew the eye drops would kill the victim, she said she was sickened because she knew they could be fatal. However, court records show the caregiver did not spend that day worried about Hernan. Instead, she opened a credit card in the victim's name on the same morning she died and bought a new flat-screen TV. Records further reveal that over the course of several years, Kurczewski had slowly stolen nearly $300,000 from Hernan's accounts through a pattern of fund transfers, cashed checks, and other fraudulent tactics. The illicit money trail showed the funds were spent on luxury goods, vacations, and feeding a gambling habit, all while leveraging the immense trust Hernan had placed in her caregiver. The alleged motif took on an even more pronounced tone when it was discovered that not only was Kurczewski draining Hernan's life savings, but she also stood to inherit a significant portion of the victim's remaining estate. The caregiver had been named as a beneficiary in Hernan's will, along with just one other person. The case took a bizarre turn when an envelope containing 37 pages of handwritten letters and documents was received by a friend of the accused, who turned it over to the police. According to prosecutors, the documents were written by Kurczewski on the back of her trial notes, giving directions to her friend on how to impersonate Hernan and fabricate materials, and submit them to the court. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution's version of events, convicting her on all counts on November 2023. 4 months later, she was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after 30 years, plus 10 additional years for the theft charges. Kurczewski continues to maintain her innocence and plans to appeal the convictions. Across the globe in Australia, a woman's alleged obsession with an ex led her down a treacherous path involving nature's own lethal bounty. In the quiet town of Leongatha, a family lunch took a shocking and tragic turn, leaving multiple lives lost and a community grappling with unanswered questions. What seemed like a casual Sunday gathering among relatives has become one of Australia's most bizarre and internationally followed alleged murder cases. At the center of this unfolding case is 48-year-old Erin Patterson, a stay-at-home mom and real estate investor whose strained relationship with her estranged husband, Simon Patterson, may have set the stage for an unthinkable act. Erin's life had been marked by both fortune and tragedy. After inheriting a substantial sum from her parents' passing in 2019, she invested wisely in several properties, affording her a comfortable lifestyle. She had an acrimonious relationship with her husband Simon. The two had been living in separate homes for some time. But in 2021, her marriage to Simon, with whom she shared 2 children, had finally dissolved. On the other side of this web of intrigue is Erin's ex, Simon, a man whose recent past held its own mysteries. He had suffered a severe and mysterious gut illness, landing him in a coma for 16 days, during which he had to have 3 emergency surgeries. And as the events of the lunch unfolded, this previous health crisis would take on new significance. The victims in this tragedy were Simon's own parents, Don and Gail Patterson, Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband, Ian, a respected pastor in the local Cornborough Baptist Church community. The 2 couples were invited by Erin for what appeared to be a family Sunday lunch. But the true motive behind this gathering was far more sinister. According to sources close to Simon, Erin had arranged the lunch in a desperate attempt to reconcile with her ex and convince his family that she was worthy of a second chance. Simon was due to attend as well, but pulled out at the last minute, narrowly avoiding the tragedy that would soon take his loved ones. That Sunday, Erin reportedly served beef Wellington, made using beef, puff pastry, and mushrooms, a dish that would soon become the center of a harrowing investigation. Within hours of consuming the lunch, all 4 guests started experiencing severe symptoms of gastro, and by the early hours of the next morning, July 30th, all 4 of the guests had been hospitalized. According to reports, Erin also went to hospital with stomach pains and diarrhea later that day. She was then transported to another medical facility where she was apparently given a liver drug and sent home. Her 4 guests had a much grimmer outcome. Despite medical interventions, the tragedy rapidly unfolded. Gail and Heather died on August 4th, followed by Dawn's passing on August 5th. Ian's grueling recovery saw him being hospitalized for another 2 months. As the devastating news rocked the local community, law enforcement swiftly took action. Erin's home was thoroughly searched, and crucial evidence was seized. Forensic testing would later reveal traces of the deadly death cap mushroom, a species capable of causing liver and kidney failure. Other symptoms of the death cap mushroom are abdominal pains, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, usually within 6 to 24 hours of ingestion. Just 1 mushroom is enough to kill a person. With all eyes on the chef, Erin told investigators that she had combined store-bought button mushrooms with dried mushrooms, purchased months earlier from a Melbourne Asian store when preparing the dish. But she couldn't remember the name or location of the Asian grocer. Days later, police questioned her again, this time about a discarded food dehydrator. Initially claiming she had dumped the appliance months earlier, she ultimately recanted her statement. She said she panicked when her lunch guests were hospitalized. So when her ex accused her of using the food dehydrator to poison them, she rushed home to discard it at the local tap. Erin had stern words for the media, saying she was grieving as well and that she had no reason to harm her in-laws.
I'm so devastated by what's happened, by the loss of Dawn. Dawn is still in hospital, the loss of Ian and Heather and Gail. They were some of the best people that I've ever met. Gail was like... Gail was the mum that I didn't have because my mum passed away 4 years ago. And Gail's never been anything but good and kind to me. And Ian and Heather were some of the best people I've ever met. They never did anything wrong to me, and I'm so devastated about what's happened.
But she wouldn't elaborate on the meal she served that day. She would later say that she even fed her kids leftovers from that deadly lunch, but admitted scraping off the mushrooms as her kids did not like it, further fueling suspicions about her potential involvement in the tragic events. The investigation took an even darker turn when Simon's previous illness from May 2022 came to light. Suddenly, the possibility of potential foul play loomed large, raising disturbing questions about whether Erin had previously attempted to kill her estranged husband through poisoning. Then, in a shocking development nearly a year and a half after the deadly incident, she was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder. The murder charges relate to the deaths from the July lunch, while 3 of the attempted murder charges stem from the separate alleged poisoning incidents involving Simon between 2021 and 2022. The remaining 2 attempted murder charges are linked to the survivor of the mushroom lunch. In May, she made her first court appearance. As the criminal proceedings continue to unfold, all eyes will remain on this disturbing case that has challenged conventional notions of familial trust. But this isn't the first time mushrooms have been the suspected method of murder. In a shocking tale of marital betrayal, an Indiana woman conspired with her friend to eliminate her husband using a deadly mushroom. This story begins with a sinister search on the dark web that leads to a chilling crime. 50-year-old Davis Fouts' body was found in a ditch in rural Indiana. Coroners were stumped, and it would remain a mystery until investigators discovered the missing piece. David was a senior tech consultant at Salesforce, a technology architect, and a family man. He and his wife, Katrina, lived comfortably with their 4 adopted greyhounds. The 50-year-old was well known as an avid cycler and a dog lover. Reports suggest that he was even planning on adopting a 5th dog soon. Besides that, David was also an involved grandfather. His stepdaughter, Carrie Lee Gentry, told investigators that he seemed like his usual self in the days leading up to his death. He had been planning on an early retirement to spend more time with his grandkids. There was, however, a side to the successful tech consultant that not many people knew about. In September 2019, David was arrested and charged with disrupting the peace during a violent encounter with his wife. He was sentenced and ordered to go to a treatment facility for his alcoholism. A no-contact order was also granted, which was eventually lifted when Katrina and David reconciled. But he had also had many affairs throughout the relationship. The pair were far from a happy couple. In the early morning hours of April 24th, 2020, a woman walking her dog along an insulated path in Noblesville in Hamilton County found a decomposing body in a ditch. The male victim was barefooted and had his pant pockets turned inside out. There were no signs of battery except for a few cuts and scratches on his hands and feet. Investigators also noticed duct tape residue on his wrists and ankles and determined that this was indeed a homicide. The victim had no ID on him, and it looked like someone had stolen his phone. By the time the woman had contacted the police, it had looked like the body had been there about 3 days. It was identified as David Fouts, but he had not been reported missing. Police almost immediately suspected Katrina Fouts of having something to do with her husband's murder. Not only had she not reported his disappearance for 3 days, but according to her cell phone records, she also didn't attempt to contact him. There was more. When the police showed up at the Fouts residence and reported that her husband had been found dead, Katrina didn't seem all too surprised. She told investigators that she had suspected something like this would eventually happen. According to Katrina, her husband had depressive tendencies, and she recanted that he was a raging alcoholic. She claimed that on the day of David's disappearance, she came home and saw that the lights upstairs were turned on. Thinking her husband had gotten home before her and gone to bed, Katrina fell asleep on the couch that night. The next morning she went up but realized that David wasn't there. She'd assumed he'd gone off to work or run a few errands. And, like I said earlier, the couple wasn't on good terms when David went missing. Katrina also pointed toward a man who'd showed up at their doorstep a few months prior and threatened her husband's life over a dispute. The man was quickly ruled out as a suspect. So, all evidence pointed toward Katrina. His stepdaughter's earlier testimony about David wanting to build dirt bikes for their kids proved that he wasn't planning on taking his life, at least not in the days leading to his body being found. There was one problem, though. The coroners had no idea how David had been killed. Investigators quickly determined that the 50-year-old's body had been moved. There were scratches on his right foot that showed that his body had been dragged at least a few feet. The scratches on his hand and the duct tape residue on his wrists and ankles also showed that he'd put up a struggle before he died. However, it seemed like there wasn't much of a fight. What had coroners scratching their heads was the fact that there was no evidence of what had killed David. Police recovered DNA samples from the victim's shirt, and none of it matched Katrina's DNA. But it did come back with a match. Terry Hopkins. The 60-year-old was a retired police officer of the Richmond Police Department. He'd also been a lifelong friend of Katrina's, who had been there when her father was dying, and the two formed a close friendship. She called him Pops, and he'd call her MKFAM, my kid from another mother. With evidence tying Terry to the crime, the police reviewed security footage from the area. In the hours leading up to the murder, they saw a vehicle matching the retired officers, driving around where David's body was found. Police also uncovered that Terry had made suspicious purchases at a hardware store days before David's death. The list included microfiber cleaning cloths, duct tape, cleaning gloves, blue tarps, a 6,400-pound lifting sling, a 500-pound hydraulic lift, and white zip ties. Police quickly arrested the 60-year-old on suspicion of murder or conspiracy to commit a crime. Katrina was interviewed again after Terry's arrest, and she admitted that she'd played a role in her husband's killing. The two had been in contact 734 times, leading up to the murder. Investigators also discovered that on the night of her husband's murder, Katrina texted Terry, thanking him for being there for her and helping her with some other stuff. Evidence suggested that the retired officer felt he had to protect Katrina from David. The Fouts had a rocky relationship, and after Katrina's father passed away, Terry became increasingly defensive about her. When the woman confided in him about David's violent behavior, he felt like something had to be done. But neither revealed what had been used to kill David Fouts. With Katrina admitting to playing a role in her husband's murder, Police now had a search warrant for her possessions, including her phone. And it would be the missing piece. She had searched the dark web multiple times on how to evade arrest for murder, how to pass a lie detector test, and laws that exonerate her from murder. Police also discovered a screenshot on her phone of the properties of leucocybe a poisonous mushroom that could, even in small doses, cause death. The mushroom causes allergy-like reactions in the human body, including dry heaving, respiratory distress, slowed heartbeat, and excessive sweating. If left untreated, anyone who injects the poisonous mushroom could be dead in a few hours. With the new evidence, coroners re-examined David's stomach contents and determined that they did contain mushroom remains. The reason why they couldn't piece this together initially was that muscarine, the mushroom toxin, has a half-life of about 8 hours. In the 72 hours since David's body had been found, there were no traces of the toxin in his body. Katrina and Terry were arrested in September 2020 for committing a murder, conspiracy to commit murder, falsifying evidence, and failure to report a corpse. Their trial began 2 years later, in April of 2022. In the meanwhile, people from all over Indiana poured in their theories for David Fouts' murder. Many suspected Terry and Katrina of having an affair. However, investigators ruled out that possibility. Some suggested that his wife was hoping to cash in on David's money before he left her, since the two were on the verge of a divorce. Others suggested that Katrina had had enough of David's abuse and snapped. This was, however, disproved by the prosecution, who determined that Katrina and Terry had meticulously planned David's murder. A jury found Katrina not guilty of murder. However, she was guilty of conspiracy to commit a crime and failure to report a corpse. A judge sentenced her to 34 years in prison. Katrina's lawyers tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that there wasn't enough evidence to tie her to the case. They appealed for a lesser sentence. The appellate court granted her appeal, and a retrial is set to take place. Terry died in February 2022 while awaiting trial. The true motive has never been discovered. Back in the US, a self-proclaimed genius took his twisted games too far, poisoning an unsuspecting family with a heavy metal that caused unimaginable suffering.
In 1988, Florida waitress Peggy Carr went to the hospital with chest pains, leg pain, and numbness. She told doctors that it felt like her body was on fire. When they couldn't find a source for the mysterious pain, they told Peggy that it was all in her head. The 41-year-old lived in a mixed household with her kids, her husband Pi, and his own children from a previous marriage. Shortly after Peggy went to the hospital, her son Dwayne and stepson Travis also began feeling the mysterious symptoms. At last, doctors began to take her pain seriously. After 3 days in the hospital, the mother was feeling a bit better, but when she went home again, the symptoms abruptly worsened, sending her back to the hospital. This time, doctors noticed something new. Peggy's hair was falling out. Luckily, one of her doctors put the pieces together, and the hospital tested for thallium poisoning. Thallium is an odorless, tasteless chemical once used as rat poison, but it's so toxic that it was banned by the EPA in the 70s. By the time Peggy's test confirmed the doctor's theory, thallium had become very rare and difficult to come by in the US. Police looked to Peggy's husband as a suspect first, but Pi Carr also had the poison in his system, along with 5 of the kids. Although they all experienced symptoms, none of them got as sick as Peggy, who had 20,000 times the normal level of thallium in her system. Shortly after returning to the hospital, the 41-year-old lost the ability to speak and slipped into a coma. On March 3, 1989, 4 months after the poisoning, Peggy was taken off of life support. Her son Dwayne and stepson Travis were also in the hospital, Dwayne for 2 months and Travis for 6. Investigators continued to look into how an entire 6-person family was dosed with a rare and restricted poison. Police tested everything in and around the Carr household and found traces of the poison in Coca-Cola bottles inside the home. The FBI also identified tiny tool marks on the bottles, showing that they had been tampered with. When they asked the family who had purchased the Coke, nobody knew. everyone had just assumed that someone else brought it home. Usually, the family bought Pepsi. The presence of thallium in the Coke explained why Peggy became so much sicker than the rest of her family. When her symptoms first appeared, she had tried to settle her stomach by drinking even more of the carbonated beverage. The Coca-Cola company hadn't received any other reports of their product being tampered with, so investigators knew this was a targeted attack. Police canvassed the neighbors. Of the 50 people they interviewed, nobody could think of a reason that the cars would have been poisoned, except the family's next-door neighbor, a man named George Trepal. When police asked Trepal why anyone would want to poison Peggy, he promptly replied, "Someone must have wanted them to move out of the neighborhood." Trepal's tone struck the police as odd. When investigators asked newly widowed Pye about his neighbor, they unearthed a long history of animosity. The Carrs lived in a rural neighborhood in Alturas, Florida, without many close neighbors and lots of distance between houses. However, they still had run-ins with George Trepal and his wife, Diana. Diana frequently complained about the noise from the Carr household. The family had barking dogs and 2 rambunctious teens who liked to ride their four-wheelers across neighboring properties. In March 1988, a year before Peggy died, George complained to a local zoning board that Pye was building a living space for his daughter and granddaughter in the garage without a permit. Pye was fined. In July of the same year, he got an anonymous letter in the mail. It was typewritten on a post-it and read, "You and your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida, or else you all die. This is no joke." Pye shrugged the note off as a prank. Then, in October, Diana came over and screamed at the family about their music being too loud. When the family ignored her shouting, Diana allegedly screamed, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." 2 days after that encounter, Peggy Carr was poisoned. Once they knew about the escalating run-ins with neighbors, police began digging into the Trepals' background. They learned that the couple was highly intelligent and members of Mensa, a group that requires its members' IQs to be in the top 2% of the population. Although Diana had a background in chemistry, police focused their investigation more on George. He fit the profile the FBI put together, an extremely intelligent white male who was outwardly passive and avoided direct confrontations. George had told the police that he wasn't home during the daytime and had no access to the Carr's home, but that was untrue. George also told police that he had never heard of thallium, but police found that he had been arrested in the 70s for running a meth lab. One of the ingredients he had used to cook meth? Thallium. During their spare time, George and Diana ran murder mystery weekends through Mensa. These weekends involved the two of them staging homicides and inviting their guests to try and solve the mystery. A month after Peggy died of thallium poisoning, George wrote the following in an information package given to his murder mystery guests. When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, "I don't like you. Move or else." Detective Susan Gorick of the Polk County Sheriff's Department went undercover to try to get more information from George. Gorick joined the suspect's Mensa group, pretending to be in the middle of a divorce and looking for friends. She managed to befriend George. Gorick later reported that every conversation she had with the suspect affirmed her belief that he was guilty. But for months, she could only find circumstantial evidence. At one point, George told Gorick that she should poison her husband to get what she wanted in her divorce. He also said to her that he had a history of dosing friends and strangers with hallucinogens as a prank. Once, the undercover investigator saw an Agatha Christie novel titled The Pale Horse in George's home. In that book, the murderer kills his victim using thallium. Gorick also learned that George's home wine setup included a device to recap bottles. The case finally broke when Diana got a new job in Florida. The couple decided to move, and Gorick offered to rent the Trepals' house when they were gone. As soon as she had the keys, police searched the house. Among other secret rooms, they found a soundproof room in the basement of the Sebring home and equipment for use in torture and bondage. The rooms were searched and tested for blood and other bodily fluids, but none were detected. However, they had seemingly just been completed. Along with a wide variety of other chemicals, they found what they were looking for: a bottle containing thallium in the garage.
Oh yeah, somebody got poison next door. Said who was it?
That might not be a lot to you, but it's a lot to me.
Oh well, sorry.
They said they never caught the person that did it, and it really frightened me.
How fast you got me? It seems they were really interested in me. I really don't know what's going on. Something just isn't falling in place here. I hope I'm not a prime suspect. That could be Nancy.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Police finally arrested George Trepal. Diana was livid and had to be restrained, but George himself was relatively calm. In their search of the couple's new house, police found a binder titled General Poison Guide. The photocopied pages inside included information on the use of thallium as a poison. They were covered in George's fingerprints. He was charged with 15 counts, including the murder of Peggy Carr, the attempted murder of her husband and children, poisoning food or water, and product tampering. The accused lawyers pointed out that the evidence in the case was purely circumstantial. They even went so far as to point out that Diana could have carried out the thallium poisoning. She also hated the neighbors and had equal access to the poison. But in the end, the evidence, though circumstantial, was overwhelming enough that the jury found George Trepal guilty on all 15 counts. He was sentenced to death in 1991. Trepal has maintained his innocence for 30 years. Defenders maintain that the evidence against him was too circumstantial to warrant an execution. They also find it suspicious that police conveniently found poison in their lead suspect's garage after pursuing him relentlessly for over a year. Others maintain that Trepal's unique knowledge and experience with thallium, which is generally rare, can't possibly be a coincidence. To them, based on this evidence, the jury's decision made sense. And especially when it was combined with the Trepal's passion for poisons, his intense dislike of the neighbors, which matched the death threat he made against the Carrs, the uncommon bottle recapping tool, and his eerie statements to his murder mystery companions. Despite receiving the death penalty, Trepal is still in prison.
Have you heard of any weird murder cases that you'd like for me to cover? Let me know in the comments down below, or you can email them to me using the address on my channel.